Hi, and welcome to another edition of Capturing Christianity. The ministry that I have here is aimed at exposing the intellectual side of Christianity. And over the past few months, I've been hosting discussions between Christians and atheists on various topics related to philosophy, religion, the existence of God. And today I have Lance Hannestad, he's our atheist guest, and Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, and he's our Christian guest. And so the topic we'll be discussing today is the argument from contingency. And so the way that I have this dialogue set up is that we'll be discussing the argument in two separate stages. The first stage involves argument that there exists some kind of necessary being. The second stage seeks to establish that this necessary being is God. And so we have these two separate sorts of stages that we'll be discussing. But before we get to the discussion, let me give you some ways to get in touch with me. The first way is through the YouTube channel. You can just subscribe. You're watching it on YouTube right now if you are watching this video. And so you can just hit subscribe there. You can get updates on when we have new live streams coming up and all that kind of good stuff. So in addition to that, you can find me on the website, capturingchristianity.com. Also on Facebook, facebook.com/capturingchristianity. Twitter @capturingchrist. That's a new one that we have. We're almost at 100 followers there. On email, if you want to get in touch with me, capturingchristianity@gmail.com. It's a lot of capturing Christianity. But so if you'd like to be on the show, or if you have any sort of recommendations for topics for future shows, just shoot me an email at capturingchristianity@gmail.com, or you can send me a message on Facebook. Those are the easiest ways. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get directly into the discussion today. And so I have, like I said, I have Josh Rasmussen here, and he's done a little bit of work in the argument from contingency. There's a couple papers on it. And so we're going to just toss it right over to you, Josh, so you can give us sort of what's this first stage of establishing a necessary being. How do we do this?
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, so just to kind of start us off, I thought it might be helpful to use some props to illustrate some different ways of dividing up theories of reality. So this is a big question. What's the nature of reality? And so we can think of maybe four basic theories. So let's say that this represents the category of things that exist, but their existence is not a matter of necessity, which is to say they have the potential for non-existence. So an example would be, let's say, a rock that comes into being or that can go out of being. And then this over here will represent the category of everything else, if there is anything else. So this would be things that can't potentially not exist. A potential example would be maybe the laws of logic. If you think they're real, you might think they have necessary existence. And so now there's four basic theories of the world. So one theory is that both these categories are empty. So there's just nothing. In fact, there's not even categories. So there's nothing that has the potential for non-existence, and there's nothing that lacks the potential for non-existence. We'll call the things that have the potential for non-existence contingent, and everything else we can call necessarily existent. Okay, so that's one theory. Another theory is that, and I just want to represent contingent. This would be like a contingent thing, fills the category of contingent. That means there's some things that are contingent, but then there's nothing that's necessary. So that's theory 2, okay, and then you see where I'm going. Theory 3 will be that they're both filled, right? And then theory 4 will be that everything that exists is necessary, and so there's nothing contingent. So we can think of the first stage of this argument from contingency as an argument for thinking that there's at least something in the category of necessary existence. And it's not the case. It's basically not the case that there's nothing. And it's not the case that there's just contingent stuff. All right. So let me just stop there and see, maybe Lance, if you have any questions about that way of dividing the theories of reality. Those are the four main theories. All theories fall within those categories.
Let me ask a question before Lance jumps in. How did you define the difference between a contingent being and a necessary being? What were those definitions?
Right. So a contingent thing will be the kind of thing that has the potential not to exist. An example would be like a rock or a person. If there's any time at which it doesn't exist, then its nature is consistent with its non-existence, because there's a time when it doesn't exist, so it's really possible for it not to be. Sometimes philosophers use the language of possible worlds. You can imagine a way the world could have been, maybe an alternative reality with different rules of physics in which this thing doesn't exist, and so then it'll be a contingent thing. Whereas a necessary thing would be the thing that has a nature that precludes its non-existence. It exists of necessity. It can't be gone from reality. That's the idea.
All right, yeah, so let's turn it over to Lance and these four theories of explanation, right? These four categories of explanation. Lance, do you have any questions? Or I think I'm following. It was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I followed the four categories. One question I have is how time plays in on this. So, for example, what if there was an event that had to have happened, but of course it only happens at one particular time? Would that be necessary because it had to have happened, or would it be contingent because it only occurs at one period of time, right? Of course, and so all of the past it didn't exist.
Yeah, that's a really good clarification question. So people will define these terms differently. The way that I use the term is that if the thing has necessary existence, it's going to exist no matter what situation it obtains, and that's going to include any time. So it's going to follow from my account that if it has necessary existence, it will exist at no matter what time it is, no matter what situation it obtains.
All right, so I guess another way of saying it is it also has to be eternal then, right? It exists at all times, all possibilities. Okay, that makes sense. I got you. Yeah, I understand.
And it's got to be
they were
eternal.
even a term.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's got to be eternal in every possible world, right? It can't just be eternal in one world and then, begin to exist in another world, right? Is that
correct?
Sort of how okay.
Yeah. And it's also helpful here to distinguish two ways of being eternal. So the basic definition, a thing is eternal if it never comes to be and never goes out of being. Two ways to be eternal. One is to be timeless. It doesn't really occupy time. It doesn't really make sense to occupy a temporal dimension. And then the other, of course, is to exist across infinite amount of time. And I would just leave that open. So when I say has necessary existence, I just mean it doesn't have the potential within its nature to come to be or to cease to be. And it lacks the potential really to fail to be. In fact, you might even say it's eternal precisely because it can't fail to be. Yeah, that's the idea.
And so we have these four different theories of explanation. The first theory was that there's basically nothing, right? You have no contingent beings, you have no necessary beings. The second one was you have some contingent beings. There's this block that's in this white Tupperware. And then the third theory is that you have contingent beings and necessary beings. You're holding the blocks up there. And then the fourth one is that we have just necessary beings. Right? Did I get that right? I mean, like I said, it's pretty straightforward, but I think it helps to just reiterate it.
Yeah, it's really important to just get that very clear. And so what I want to do is just start with the first theory, because I think we can probably agree that the first theory is false. The first theory being that there's nothing exists, we don't exist. But because we're in deep waters, we want to cover all of our bases, right? So here's my argument against the first theory. We can see if Lance thinks this is a good argument, but it's sort of this ancient argument that I'm aware of my own existence, and if I actually try to deny my existence, I become aware of my own denial of my existence, and so that verifies that there's at least something, namely the denial of my existence. If there were nothing, right, then we couldn't even have this conversation. And so this is a reason that I have for thinking that first theory is false, which then leaves three theories left, two of which have necessary existence. And so then we can investigate whether the one that doesn't have necessary existence is the correct one or not, and what reasons there are. So let me just see if there are any questions about the falsity of that first theory, that there's nothing.
Oh, yeah. You don't have to convince me that I exist. I completely agree.
I'm not surprised by that, although I will say I have met a philosopher who denied his existence to me. It was at a philosophy conference. And it was very interesting because I was asking him, well, if you think that you don't exist, I mean, aren't you aware of your own thoughts through introspection? And he said, well, science sort of reveals that introspection may not be fully reliable. and he had some philosophical objections to his existence. But even he thought that at least something exists, right? So I think we can all agree to that starting point. So that's good. And I want to start with what's clearest, because I think a path towards truth is really to begin with what's clearest and see what we can build there. Especially when it comes to these deep things, I think there's a lot of debate and people rush to places where there's ambiguity and unclarity. But sometimes I find that you can actually put a light into the things that were otherwise unclear by starting with what's clear and then proceeding from there. So that's going to be my basic strategy.
And so from here, basically what we need to do in order to establish the existence of a necessary being would be to rule out that second theory or that second hypothesis, whatever you want to call it. Right?
Okay. Yes. So now, I mean, sometimes also in philosophy, we try to give these proofs. And one thing I like about science is that in science, we're trying to find out what's true by seeking the best explanation. We have theories and we test it with evidence. And I think that's a good way to approach these questions in terms of at least maybe what's the best explanation, what's the most probable. And so I just want to start by pointing out a problem. And this is the reason that I have for questioning this theory that everything is contingent. So here's the container of contingent things. So it's not empty, presumably. Now, if you think this container is empty, since we already have agreed that something exists, then it would follow that there is, well, I'm going to stop using containers. I'm going to just use these blocks. This will be the next, whatever it is, if there's any such thing. This will be contingent things, if there are any such things. So we agree that there's something, okay, and if the something that exists is necessary, then we're done with the first stage, first part of our conversation. We can move on to stage 2. So for sake of argument, I want to assume that what exists includes contingent things, right? So another question is whether everything that exists is contingent. And here there's a certain puzzle if you say yes to that. And the puzzle is accounting for how this container really could fail to be empty, how there could actually be something in it. And to illustrate this, I just want to start with something very clear and see if we can all agree to this. So in this container right here, this actual container, I predict that there won't be a marshmallow appearing in here from the land of imagination into the land of reality without any cause or any explanation. And this is a prediction, and I'm going to predict that this won't happen within the next 5 minutes. Now, in the history of the universe, this theory has never been tested, so we're going to test it live right here on this show. And my theory is that this marshmallow won't appear. And I actually just want to confirm and make sure that we're on the same page, that you guys think that this theory is probably going to come out to be true, that there's going to be no marshmallow appearing right here. Are we safe so far?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to agree. Oh, so
I'm going slowly. I'm going slowly because I think the clearest path to truth, is, like I said, is to build carefully and slowly. So that's why I'm doing that. The other reason is because if we ask ourselves then, okay, what justifies that belief? Right now we're testing it, and we're going to be able to find out in the next 5 minutes if a marshmallow appears. But even before we perform the test, I think we all are pretty secure in our belief. We're not agnostic about whether the marshmallow will appear. So we can ask, well, what justifies that, right? And well, here's a hypothesis that would account for that. And this, I think, is the simplest hypothesis that accounts for it. Or if there's a simpler one, then it's compatible with the hypothesis I'm giving. So the hypothesis is that things that have the potential to not exist, but actually do exist, they're not going to actually exist unless there's some cause or explanation available to account for why they're included within reality rather than not. And so the idea is that if there's a contingent reality, so there's some contingent reality, then we want to understand what explains its existence. If we say it's just a brute fact that this thing exists, there's no explanation, then we lose this account of why we can even believe that a marshmallow won't just appear within reality from the land of imagination. So, so this is a bit of evidence in support of this general principle that contingent realities don't just bring themselves into existence uncaused. Now, there's other hypotheses that can explain this. My proposal is that this is the simplest hypothesis that accounts for all of our experiences, and that if we give up this hypothesis, then we have this deep puzzle. And the puzzle is to account for how it is that we never observe things, random things, come to be or go out of being just inexplicably on their, just by their, on their own. So that's the idea. Questions, comments, pushbacks at this point?
Yeah, I agree that that your principle predicts that things will not just come into existence. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so then this is not going to be a mathematical proof, but since the principle predicts that hypothesis, then that it predicts the data that the marshmallow won't appear from nothing. And it's not just the marshmallow, it predicts also the same thing for two marshmallows together. And here, I think there's this principle of irrelevant differences between one marshmallow and another marshmallow, or one marshmallow and a cube, or a cube and a square. For a long time, I wondered, well, maybe there could be some exceptions. I don't want to be hastily assuming that this principle applies across the board. But then the more I thought about it, and the more I began to think about examples, it seemed to me that there's not a relevant difference between a marshmallow and a cube and a particle and a planet that could account for the ability to come to be from nothing, but that instead the best account for why something couldn't come to be from nothing is precisely that it has necessary existence. That would account for why it doesn't come from nothing. Whereas if everything that exists has the potential for non-existence, then we have this deep puzzle of trying to account for why there is anything, right, at all, rather than just nothing. If you say that the contingent reality just snapped into being or even was eternal without any explanation, then that's going to contradict this principle that seems to be confirmed by our experiences. So that's the basic one form of the argument from contingency, which basically puts a problem, gives a reason to doubt that everything that exists is purely contingent, because if it were, then we'd have this problem of unexplained contingent existence. That's the idea.
Now, Lance, I can just I can throw it over to you, or I can just I can raise one of my objections, or at least a really popular objection is to say, well, what if things just existed eternally? Like, why do we need a further explanation? We can just go back, say that event A, or event, let's actually use B. Event B exists because it was caused by event A. What about something like that? Why is that not a good? Why do we require some additional explanation if the thing that we're talking about exists eternally?
Yeah, very good question. So I think it's helpful to think of reality in total. This is kind of what we're doing. We're trying to build a worldview, and worldviews are focused on reality in total. So let's just say like this is reality in total. Now, what's interesting is that there is no explanation outside of reality in total. And you can actually see this using the law of non-contradiction, because if there were an explanation outside of reality in total, then this thing outside of reality would be both real and not real, and that's a contradiction. So what reason reveals, the law of non-contradiction actually reveals that we have a two-category reality. We have a reality in which there's some portion of reality, namely the totality, that lacks an outside explanation. This is already weird because the things we ordinarily experience have outside explanations beyond themselves. And so just the law of non-contradiction reveals that there's a two-category reality. There's the unexplained, and there's the things that we experience which have an explanation. So this leads us back to that puzzle to account for how there can be these two categories, the unexplained and the explained. And a solution to this would be to say that, well, it's because there's two kinds of things. There's a contingent things that have an explanation beyond themselves, and then there's a necessary thing that exists just by the necessity of its own nature, and it can then provide the ultimate explanation for why there are the contingent things. And in some sense, either you say it explains its own existence, it exists because it can't not, or you say because it has necessary existence, it's the kind of thing that just can't have an explanation. That kind of makes sense. So it's consistent with our experiences. And the thing about the infinite regress is that it doesn't even address this deeper question about the totality. Because even if there's an infinite regress, we can still ask of the entire chain, is that chain necessarily existent or is it contingent? If it's necessarily existent, then we move on to stage 2. If it's contingent in its nature, then we haven't found an explanation for its existence, unless you say that there's a circular explanation. So it exists just because it exists, but then that's not the kind of explanation that we experience when we're trying to understand our world. We experience one thing is explained by another thing. So I don't think the infinite regress really even addresses the problem. In fact, Richard Taylor is famous for making the point that the mere age of a thing does nothing to explain why that thing is included in reality. Why is there that eternally old blue ball or universe or particle rather than just nothing? And I think the temptation actually to think that the infinite age would explain the existence of something is precisely because we realize that if something had necessary existence, that would explain its infinite age. So if something had an eternal existence, then the best explanation of its eternal existence is precisely that it has necessary existence. I think then this would then lead to the question, okay, well, why think the necessarily existing thing transcends the universe? But again, that's stage 2. So if we're just looking at stage 1, is there a necessary thing? The infinite regress really just does nothing to address this more basic problem of how there can be anything if everything is purely contingent in its nature. Does that make sense?
I have a thought. Well, that last thing you said, the question of how can there be anything if everything is contingent. That I'm not sure how to answer that question, but it seems like a kind of a different question than what was being got at before with the infinite regress point. I think the issue is not so much the fact that because it's just so old that it doesn't need an explanation. I think the point is more that within the totality of existence, there are particular things, and each particular thing has an explanation. And if each particular thing has an explanation, well, then it seems plausible that there's no explanation over and above the conjunction of all those explanations for the particular things. Like, for example, if you went to the supermarket and you saw 5 of your friends just kind of off doing their own little thing, and you walked up to each one of them and said, "Hey, why are you here?" And they gave you a reason. One said, "I was here to buy peaches." The other one needed broccoli or something. Well, you have your explanation. And it seems a little weird to think, okay, I know why each one individually came to the supermarket, but why are they all here at once? I mean, maybe you'd think that there is some overarching explanation, but I'm a little skeptical that there would always have to be.
Right, yeah, so that's a great example. And it's related to a famous example of Eskimos being at a street corner. And maybe you could explain why each one is there individually, but why I think that there's this sort of overarching explanation of the totality of the whole. And part of the issue here, I think, is the term explanation can sort of mean different things in different contexts. But I have in mind a very minimal notion of explanation, some kind of condition that would allow the effect to even be possible. So even in the case of, let's say, a bunch of people buying different things or being in a certain location, let's say there's an explanation for each one. Well, in that case, you can take the conjunction of the explanations, and that conjunction of explanations will then provide an explanation of the totality. Whereas in the infinite regress, there's a special problem because there, if you take the conjunction of explanations and you say, well, that explains the effect, then you actually get a circularity because the infinite regress includes all the explanations all the way out. And so if you want to avoid a circular explanation, then it looks like you're going to have to appeal to something beyond the series. And now I realize your point, Lance, is that well, maybe you wouldn't need an explanation. You're not saying that you would have an explanation. You're saying maybe you wouldn't need an explanation. And that's a really good distinction, and that's a nice hypothesis to consider. And so here's my response to that. So why think that the need for an explanation would apply to multiple things or to things connected rather than just to individual things? And my argument for that is really the same as the argument against thinking that a marshmallow is going to appear in the next few seconds or minutes, which is that it's not just that one marshmallow won't appear, but any combination of marshmallows, any group of marshmallows, any bunch of marshmallows or cubes or even universes, no matter how big, no matter how complex, no matter if they're causally connected, right? Because you could imagine maybe that the top half of the marshmallow is causally connected to its bottom half, and the bottom half is causally connected to half of its bottom half in an infinite regress. But that infinite causal regress won't explain the entire chunk of reality, whether infinite or finite, won't explain its existence, and it won't remove the need for an explanation, precisely because we never find any kind of chaos of contingent things existing without an explanation. So this is part of why I think the infinite regress doesn't really remove the need for an explanation. It doesn't really solve this deeper puzzle of why there are the contingent things. Why this set of contingent things rather than some other set? You can't appeal to the contingent things themselves to account for that. And I don't think that it's going to help to say, well, there doesn't need to be an explanation, because you never have any set of contingent things appear with no explanation. Maybe it's just theoretically possible, but it doesn't really match our experiences. So that's my thought. I don't know if you want to come back on that or what you think about that.
Yeah, I think I half agree. I think you're right that you can, even if there was an infinite regress, you could always ask, well, but why this infinite regress instead of another? But I guess we started off talking about causation, and we kind of slipped into talking about explanation. And it's not clear to me that those are the same kinds of things. I think I might grant some of or I might grant most of this if we're talking about explanation, but it's not clear to me that if we're talking about causation, the same problem occurs. If I can identify the cause for every particular thing that exists, it seems a little odd to say that there must then be some further cause over and above the causes of each particular.
Yeah, and I think that's a helpful distinction. And so in this context, I want to use the term cause in the sort of least controversial way. So I don't want to assume anything about what it takes to be a cause. And so I'm thinking a cause will be any sort of condition that can play some role in explaining the effects. This is where now the term explanation comes in. But I think you make a nice distinction. Maybe there is a notion of cause where if each member has a cause, we no longer need to seek a cause of the series, although that's consistent with still seeking an explanation of the series. We're not going to have series of causally connected marshmallows appear from nowhere. Why not? Well, because there's this principle, we could call it a principle of explanation, if not causation. And the principle is that series, whether causally connected or not, are not going to appear unless there's some explanation of their existence. And the idea is that this principle, again, accounts for our ordinary experiences, and it's the simplest principle that accounts for our ordinary experiences. And so that's a reason. It's not a proof, but it's some reason to think the principle is true. Does that seem okay to you?
Yeah, I think I can go along with that. I guess maybe I would say that, I guess what I mean by a cause, and I guess we can define our terms any way we want, but what I would think of as a cause is kind of the notion of something that makes something else the case. Whereas an explanation might not always be that, though I'm having trouble coming up with an example where it wouldn't be. But, yeah, so I guess we could just stick with your definitions. And yeah, okay, I'll grant this up to this point. I'm curious to see what comes next.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there are many different pathways. So I have this website called necessarybeing.com where people can explore whether they already are inclined to think that something is true or something that seems true will logically entail that there's a necessarily existent reality. And it's pretty interesting because most of the people who go to that website, whether they think there is a necessary being or not, most people do already have beliefs or are inclined to think certain things are true that entail a necessary being. Most of the people who think that there is no necessary being will give answers that entail that there is. Now, it's not 100%, it's just a tool to explore. I mentioned this just to point out that there are many different pathways, so it's been kind of an interesting research project for me just to explore and see where reason might lead as I look at different possibilities. And one pathway that is kind of less well known moves not from actual causes, but from possible causes. And so the idea is that if we consider a category, so we consider the category of contingent reality, and we want to know, okay, well, why is that category not empty? Why is there something in it rather than nothing? Well, it turns out that we don't even need to say that there has to be a cause of that. Even if it's just possible, and when I say possible, I mean consistent with the necessary rules of reason. So if it's even consistent with the necessary rules of reason that there is a cause of contingent things, that the category of contingency is not empty because of some cause, then what follows from that is that there's some possible world in which there is a necessarily existing thing that's capable of producing contingent things. But then a necessarily existing thing was defined as the kind of thing that would exist in all the possible worlds. It doesn't have the possibility within its nature not to exist. So if it exists in any possible world, then we have some reason to think that it would also exist in our world. So this is an argument from possible causes. And the pushback on this argument is to question, or at least the pushback that I generally get, is to push back on the premise that there is even possibly a cause of the contingency existing, the category of contingent things being occupied rather than empty. And so here I would also argue for that in a variety of ways. One is through an inference to the best explanation of all the cases of contingent types possibly, in fact, actually having an explanation, but at least possibly having an explanation. There's no rule of reason that anybody has identified that rules that out. And so the best explanation of all of our cases of, for example, there's a cause of there being marshmallows, there's a cause of there being bread, and not just particular marshmallows, but even just of the type being a marshmallow, the type being bread. And so we can generalize. So for any contingent type, there's possibly a cause of that. And that would just be an independent path. And I'm giving this independent path because the more lines up to the same conclusion, the more confidence I think we can have in finding that conclusion to be supported by reason and ultimately to be true. So I don't know if you have questions about that or any of these other paths.
No, it sounds interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to ask. But
yeah, I'm just sort of along for the ride. I'm enjoying this this back and forth between you guys. I'll let me just raise this one objection that I hear a bunch, and it's sort of related to the ontological argument, and it's this idea that when we're talking about this thing that is possibly necessary, that's sort of like almost begging a question. If we're looking at we go from this step, it's basically like you're already affirming the conclusion when you affirm the premise that is possible, because it's logically equivalent in a sense. That's the objection that I see a lot with the ontological argument, and this one sounds really similar. You know, if all of contingent reality has some explanation or possibly has an explanation, it seems like that's you're already sort of affirming the conclusion. It's almost logically equivalent there. So what do you think about that, Josh?
Yeah, that's a common question. It's a good question. And I want to distinguish between two issues. So one thing about the ontological argument that makes that argument tougher to defend is that there is a reversed form of the argument where if you think that it's possible that a perfect being exists, you might equally think it's possible that a perfect being doesn't exist. turns out that those possibilities are not logically compatible given other premises in the argument. So maybe you should just say, well, we don't know which one is possible, right? Because it cancels out with this other possibility premise. The other issue, which is related, is once you see that a premise entails some interesting conclusion, and you see maybe even that conclusion, then that might lead you to become skeptical of that original premise, right? There's sort of this question-begging worry. So now, with respect to the reverse ontological argument, one thing that's interesting about this argument from possible causes that's importantly different from the ontological argument is that it's not clear that there's an equivalent reversal where there's a premise that is no less plausible, a possibility premise that contradicts the steps in the argument. So the most obvious candidate premise would be contingent reality possibly doesn't have a cause. But it turns out that that's fully compatible with the conclusion of the argument that there's a necessarily existing thing that possibly causes contingent reality. So that's not going to cancel out the argument. It's not going to even come in conflict with the possibility that contingent reality have a cause. So that's one point. And as far as question begging, here I think I want to kind of say two things. First, I want to affirm that if a premise implies something that you have reason to think is false, that can be a reason to recheck that premise. So in the necessarybeing.com website, there was a university philosophy professor who doesn't think there's a necessary being, but he reported answers that entail a necessary being, and so that helped him to see that one of the tempting premises that he thought was true, now he's committed to rejecting that. And so it can go that way if you have independent reason to think there isn't a necessary being or a necessary reality. But on the other hand, if you don't have that independent reason, you can start with what's clearest, right? You can start with, well, does this seem possible? And if it does seem possible, there's no rule of reason that rules that out, and that's how I'm defining possibility here. Then that's going to be a reason then to infer whatever logic tells you to infer from that premise, if that premise seems true. And if you don't have independent reason to doubt that premise or the conclusion, then it can actually free you to see something you hadn't seen before. And even if you do have independent reason, then you have to do the complicated thing of weighing the reasons. And I think sometimes in these conversations on these big questions, people use arguments not so much to free people to see new things, but I think more almost like to trap people. And I think when that happens, then it blocks progress of understanding. But we don't have to think of this argument as trapping anybody. You can just consider it for yourself. Does the premise seem true to you? If it does, then you can follow reason where it leads. If it doesn't seem true to you, that's fine. There's no problem there. Just ask yourself whether it seems true. So that would be my response to that.
Yeah,
that's a good question.
Lance, if you don't mind, let me. I want to come back on that real quick. So it seems to me that later on in the argument, we're going to find some sort of conflict with the way that you've your response to the first worry that I raised, or rather the way that you articulated it, the way that you sort of split it up was the first one was to say if we flip that premise to say possibly contingent reality doesn't have an explanation, then that's actually compatible with the other one, with the other premise that we were talking about. And so it doesn't seem like we have this area where the other one just seems perfectly plausible in the case of the modal ontological argument. But here's sort of my worry, is that later on in the argument, we sort of learn that this necessary being explains all of contingent reality. And so it would seem that we can't affirm that premise. We can't affirm that possibly contingent reality doesn't have an explanation. So it would seem that at first, yeah, it might seem plausible, but then later on in the argument, we learn that this necessary being or group of beings explains all contingent reality. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, I was thinking if somebody thought that you could have contingent things that have no explanation, then that person will be open to saying that contingent reality is ultimately not explained. The point is that that's still consistent with there actually existing and necessarily existing powerful thing that is able to produce contingent things. Now, maybe that's odd. I mean, I actually think that you can then build from there. So I have this kind of Sherlock's Holmes principle where if you have an available explanation and it's the only available explanation, then you have a good reason to think that it actually is an explanation. It'd be different if you had no available explanation. Well, if you have an independent reason to think there's a necessarily existing foundation, now it may be quite reasonable to infer that, in fact, it also explains contingent reality. But the point is you don't have to think that to follow this argument to the conclusion that there's a necessarily existing foundation, and then to move on to stage 2.
Yeah, so let's get Lance to come back, and what are your thoughts on this new formulation of the argument with the possibility?
Oh, well, what I was gonna mention was I actually don't have so much of a dog in this fight. I'm not super skeptical of necessary beings and all that. So yeah. But
and just to affirm this, so you are an atheist, though, right? You believe that God doesn't exist, or you sort of lack that belief, right?
Yeah, I would believe, not just lack, but
okay. So you have the belief that God does not exist.
Yeah, and I guess I should say, oh shoot, my laptop froze for a second. Actually, do you mind if I pop out? Or actually, you know what? Like, we could just continue. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can still hear you and everything. So, if for some reason you pop out, then just shoot me a message on Facebook.
Yeah, no worries. It's just my computer has this weird glitch where the screen will just freeze up and become unresponsive to input, but it's working. That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. I guess the main premise of this next argument does seem much more agreeable. That every contingent thing possibly has an explanation. That seems pretty right to me. Though,
and you just said that you're open to the existence of a necessary being, right? You're still an atheist, but you just think this necessary being is going to be something like the universe or a physical object or something like that.
Yeah. I don't know what it would be like. I have no idea.
But it wouldn't be God.
Probably not. I guess we'd have to see stage 2 of those arguments to
right. And this is actually
that,
and this is actually a perfect time to transition to stage 2. We're about at the 45-minute mark here. So why don't we go ahead and do that, Josh? Why don't we move into to stage 2 of the argument? And obviously, you know, we could discuss stage 1 all day, and we barely even scratched the surface. So, but in any case, let's move on to stage 2. And so, how would you sort of move us in that direction?
Well, yeah, we could discuss stage 1 for years. So there's a lot of complex issues and a lot of steps we move through quickly. And so I don't want to suggest, given the context of this exchange, that there's not more to obviously think about and to explore, and questions that could be asked and challenges to the various steps. So I just want to acknowledge that. But as far as stage 2, I was thinking that it might be helpful just to think about this in a kind of scientific way, where we consider various hypotheses about reality in total. And the thing about thinking about worldview is that a worldview is considering hypotheses about really, you know, here's my analogy for the totality of reality, rather than thinking just about positing some particular thing within reality. So we're looking at theories of the totality. And I think I just want to really emphasize that distinction, because I think in the popular culture especially, there's this association of a theistic theory of the totality, I think, with religion and maybe certain religious ways of thinking, and particular theories about particular things within reality. And I think that often that's very distracting. I think that it causes unnecessary stumbling blocks to seeing more clearly the important distinctions when we're looking at theories about the totality in general. So when we consider the totality in general, we could divide the theories of the totality into just sort of a small cluster of classical theories that human beings continue to think about and investigate. So one of the theories would be that there's nothing, right? This is both categories are empty theory. Everything's an illusion, right? So that's one of the theories. So we're in agreement in thinking that that one's false, or at least probably false. Another theory would be that everything in totality is maximally simple. And one reason for this is that it provides the least arbitrary account of the totality. So there's just sort of this unity of one. And this leads to a kind of panentheist theory would be one version of this, or a monism. But then this would contradict the experience of change, and I assume that we're on the same page that reality isn't maximally simple. Well, then there's this third theory of reality where it's not that reality in total is maximally simple. But remember what I said before about how the totality has no outside explanation, and so this leads to a two-category theory of reality where things that we experience in ordinary life have an outside explanation, but not reality in total. And we could account for that if we have a necessarily existing thing capable of explaining, causally explaining contingent things. So now we can come up with hypotheses about the nature of this thing. And one hypothesis I think is worth beginning with is the simplest hypothesis. This is how science works. We look at hypotheses that can explain the data. And a simple hypothesis would be that the foundation is itself maximally simple. This is consistent with sort of a classic understanding of the foundation. It's maximally simple. I think to quote a more popular spokesperson for atheism, Richard Dawkins, he seeks a simple foundation of things. This is one of his objections to arguments from design. As he would say that if you're going to argue for design and posit a designer, the designer should be at least as complex as what's designed, but he thinks that the best explanation of complexity is going to be ultimately in terms of simplicity. And I think he's right about that, actually. I think simplicity provides the simplest count of the foundation. And so what I want to propose here is that the foundation is maximally simple, and then we can investigate how that hypothesis bears on various data. So let me just pause there and see if there are questions about this way of setting up our investigation into the foundation.
So by the foundation, you mean the ultimate cause or thing that explains, right?
Yes,
Right.
That's what I think. Other questions or comments, clarification so far?
Why is it the simplest explanation that the ultimate cause is simple or maximally simple? Or sorry, could you repeat that part?
You got the microphone muted, Josh.
Thank you. Yeah. So far, I'm just coming up with this hypothesis that it's simple, and then I want to explore the hypothesis with you. So one way to kind of begin to think about this that I find helpful is to consider examples of things that we are pretty sure aren't the necessarily existing foundation. So I've got like my hand here. I assume you agree that this hand isn't the uncaused, necessarily existing producer of everything else. But then I could ask, well, why do you think that? Why do you think my hand didn't produce everything else? I think we're pretty sure that it didn't do it, but what's our basis for that? And I have a proposal for what would support that inference. Two parts. One is that this hand is complex in a certain way. So we could imagine that this hand or some other hand produced everything else. But then that theory is going to be a more complex theory, and more complex theories, other things being equal, are going to be less likely than simpler theories. So that's a first thought. Simplicity increases the probability. And then a second thought is that we know that hands have an outside explanation. And now maybe you don't know about this hand, but this hand is not relevantly different from the things that we do know and have an outside explanation. And so this is sort of two independent flashlights that give us a reason to think that the foundation of all things, the ultimate explanation of everything, is not going to have as its basic nature the features of a flesh and blood hand. That would be more complex than what's necessary, and it would make it sort of irrelevantly different from the things that we know have an explanation. So how are we doing so far with that as a reason, at least to make progress on thinking that it's not a hand? And this argument, of course, generalizes that if it's not a hand, it's not a turtle, it's not a cube, it's not a triangle. All those things alike have arbitrary, inexplicable limits if they're at the foundation. And that's going to be less simple, so less plausible than the maximally simple theory of the foundation. What do you think about that so far?
It doesn't strike me as right to say that because the cause or the thing doing the explaining sorry, is complex or composite or made up of many different things, or has maybe a very complex nature, that therefore the explanation in terms of that thing is overly complex. I mean, for example, what would be a good example? Maybe, I don't know, if tea was boiling on the stove and you asked me, well, why is it boiling? And I said, I wanted to make tea. That seems like a pretty simple explanation, but I am an incredibly complex, biological, psychological entity, as opposed to maybe you could say something like, well, I don't know, some fundamental substance came along and interacted with the kettle to cause it to boil. That seems like a more complicated explanation, even though it appeals to entities that are ontologically simple, right? Entities that are not composite entities made up of many different things or having, I don't know, a complex nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah, those are great examples, and it helps us to clarify what we mean by complex. So we could mean different things. In this context, because I'm interested in the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis, I'm thinking of complexity in terms of the number of basic concepts required to express the hypothesis. So for example, the hypothesis that this was produced by an invisible flying spaghetti monster is going to involve many concepts to express that. And so there's probably a variety of objections you might raise to that theory, but one of the objections that I would raise would be that it's so much more complicated than what's necessary to explain what we need to explain, apart from it probably being metaphysically impossible. But so does that help to think of complexity in terms of the number of basic concepts required to express the theory?
Well, yes, okay, but then I'm not, that seems a little funny to me, because the number of basic concepts required to express a theory or anything at all kind of depends on our language and I guess the richness of the nouns we have in our language. You can use a single word, Lance, to talk about me, to say Lance boiled water to make tea. Whereas, let's just say that God is in fact the explanation, the ultimate cause. And suppose we never came about to naming God. We never gave him the name God, capital G-O-D. And we could only express this explanation by saying, well, there is some being that is perfectly powerful and morally perfect and, omniscient, omnipotent, and so on. And this is the being. That would require a greater number of basic concepts to express, even though that is the explanation you think is correct. So, yeah, I guess in short, my issue is, doesn't this make whether or not an explanation is good or not super relative to the language we have and I guess the conceptual resources we have to talk about things?
Yeah, that's a very penetrating question. It's a good question, very insightful. I think it might help to maybe use an example from science where you have a plot. We could just have an example. Let's say there's a specimen that has a certain mass, and as it increases in mass, maybe when it's 1 gram, its temperature is 1 degree Celsius or whatever you want to say. When it's 2 grams, it's 2 degrees. When you measure it at 4 grams, it's 4 degrees. And so then you come up with a hypothesis to account for the data. And it turns out that there's infinitely many hypotheses that will account for that data. That you could imagine that there's this wild curve that goes up and down, but just by coincidence goes through those points. But the idea is that the simplest hypothesis of that data is going to be a straight line. And that's because we can express that in the fewest basic terms when we're actually defining that line. You can define the line in terms of the endpoints, and that's going to provide a simpler account. Even though all these other hypotheses will equally explain the data, if all we have to go on is that data, then because of the simplicity of the straight line hypothesis, that's going to be evidence for it. Again, it's not a proof, it's just a reason to prefer it, other things being equal. Now, you raise an important question about, well, how do you measure complexity? Isn't complexity sort of relative to your language, to your concepts? And I'm not really sure, how to answer that. It might be, so one hypothesis that I have, just thinking about this as I've thought about this before, is that maybe our epistemic stance, when I say epistemic there, I mean our kind of ability to know or to have reasonable belief given our conditions is relative to the concepts that we have. And so maybe the best I can do is consider my own concepts, and now I'm defining in terms of basic concepts. So some concepts I can define in terms of other concepts, like red and square will be a more complex concept in terms of red, which is a more basic concept. And I can just take my own basic concepts, and then I can figure out what's the simplest hypothesis in light of my concepts. And then that will give me some reason to think that that theory expressed in those concepts is more likely, until I meet somebody else who, let's say, has different concepts, and after we've talked for a long time, it looks like we don't have the same basic concepts, in which case that will give me a defeater. But I'm talking about basic concepts in my experience, especially with respect to these theories of the foundation, but also in science. I think that there's a wide overlap. So people generally have the same concepts, and that's why science can make progress using this basic principle of inference. Does that help address the? There's so many other questions. I can't solve it. In short, I have to say I don't know, but I don't think that this question of complexity undermines the basic inference to the best explanation, where simplicity factors in. Does that seem to make sense to you?
Oh yeah. Well, I suppose I don't deny a sort of principle of parsimony in general, and I certainly think that inferences to the best explanation are good inferences. I guess what I'm thinking of is just kind of basic concepts we have. They're, I guess, kind of in a sense arbitrary. They're the result of us giving names to things. And it just seems a little weird then that whether or not, how high something ranks on whether or not it's a good explanation. It seems pretty odd to say that that's relative to the way you've gone about to name things in your universe. I think typically when we talk about an explanation being simpler or more complex, well, at least when I do, I mean something like ontological simplicity. Like, does it require that we posit greater or fewer many things? And if it requires that we posit as few many things as possible, or fewer than another explanation, then that's a pretty good that's a better explanation. Though I guess I kind of see an intuition for this. There is, I guess, kind of a sense in which, like your straight line example, where an explanation, I don't know, I don't even know how to say it, but yeah, if it can be spoken simpler, or I don't know, maybe it is right to say that if an explanation uses fewer nouns, then that is in some sense better.
I just want to affirm what you said about positing fewer entities. I share that intuition with you. Oh, and also, actually, since we share some beliefs, I really wanted to celebrate with you the way in which theists and atheists could, in principle, agree that there's a two-category theory. That's a fruitful theory of reality independently of these other questions about theism. And I think sometimes theism can sort of become a distraction from this kind of progress, where people who maybe see the world differently in other respects can come to this important place of maybe seeing eye to eye. So I want to just throw that in there. But But yeah, I also want to affirm that I think that's right, that we don't want to posit unnecessary complexity in terms of even the number of things. And my understanding as I think about this is that it's precisely because the theory, when we express the theory that posits more things, there's going to be more basic concepts in that very theory. So like if we posit, oh, I don't know, like 10 different things, then we have to describe those 10 different things in our theory. And the reason why I don't think that it's enough to account for simplicity just in terms of the number of things, I think the straight line example illustrates that to a certain extent, but also because there's another way in which every hypothesis trivially entails an infinite number of things. Because, for example, every hypothesis entails, for example, that the proposition that that hypothesis is true, right? Now, I mean, this may just sort of seem trivial, and one could even object to the existence of propositions, but it seems like an objection to the existence of propositions doesn't really get to the heart of the worry, which is that it's not the number of things by itself that's really playing a role here. So I think if you have a very simple theory of the foundation of things, and that theory can provide an explanation of all the complexity that arises, well, I wouldn't say that that theory is therefore less likely because of the complexity that it explains or predicts. Its likelihood is intrinsic to the conceptual complexity. And I do think that there are further questions about how we measure conceptual complexity. The best that I can do is just start with the concepts I have and just ask myself, how complex does this seem? How likely does this seem from my perspective? If somebody expresses a different view about that, then instantly I'm curious and I want to, maybe we're not expressing the same hypothesis, or maybe I think the hypothesis is simpler than it really is, and so I'll continue to investigate.
And I wonder if this if you want to call it an objection of, our language is imperfect, I wonder if that would actually have deeper worries if we wanted to run with that a little bit further and think of, this might even lead to some sort of global skepticism if we can't even talk about these ideas without having, some fundamental concepts and agreed upon definitions and all that stuff. And it's like, if we have to do that for everything that we talk about, if we always have to go out and find and be completely 100% clear on what is meant, what the concepts are, how they apply in reality, and all this stuff, and it would seem like we don't really have a grasp of much of anything. Like we could break everything down. Drinking this cup of tea right here, we could break that down into where it just wouldn't make sense of anything. So I worry that if we went that route, if we went a little bit too far that way, and this sort of goes back to the video you just made, Josh, where we're looking at these two different sort of polar opposites. So instead of being on the one side, we want to be somewhere in the middle, where we can sort of still make sense of what we're saying and doing. And that's just sort of the worry that I was thinking about when Lance, you brought this objection up. But I want to, if we can, to move on to the next step of the argument. So let's assume that the ultimate explanation of reality is going to be supremely simple. And then let's see sort of where we can go from there. Because I think most people will sort of intuitively see that, yeah, and even Dawkins sees it too. It's like, we want this explanation to be simple. Maybe that doesn't prove that the explanations are going to be simple, but it seems plausible that explanation would be simple. And so, but let's move on to the next step. Like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, and I just want to add here too, I think before looking at this step about what to think about this simple thing, is the difference in concepts that people have, I think, can also invite epistemic humility, where maybe my concepts aren't the same as yours, and this is part of what can allow us to have a reasonable, productive disagreement and joint discovery. I sometimes feel like people are so quick to objectify their beliefs and say this is the sort of justified view and any other view is unjustified. I found it much more helpful in thinking through the world and just puzzling on my own and just trying to find truth. What does reason lead me to think? To just see what seems true from all that I've considered. And if that doesn't seem true to everybody else, well, that's an invitation to be curious, but doesn't thereby mean it doesn't seem true to me, if that makes sense. And I think that can invite, it can actually lead to greater progress because it creates more humility, right? So just now to go on to this next stage, so we have the two-category theory of reality. If this is the simplest theory, well, the simplest theory that I understand of the foundation is not that it's a flying spaghetti monster or that it has some particular number of particles that happen to allow it to evolve into a universe that allows life to exist, but that it has all perfections. And what I mean by this is that if you think of value on a scale of more and less, the simplest theory of the nature of the foundation is that its value is maximal. If you say it has some cutoff to its degree of value, some limit, some boundary, then you have a more complex theory about its basic nature. And second, you also have an arbitrary limit. And arbitrary limits, like other limits we experience in life, have an explanation beyond themselves. And so if I want to build my theory of the world based on what I experience, based on what I do know, it's maybe theoretically possible it has arbitrary limits that are unexplained. But that doesn't seem to me to be the best explanation, the best hypothesis about the foundation. The best one seems to be the simplest, that it's just simply perfect and therefore maximal. And then from that basic hypothesis, we can derive the core classic attributes. These aren't just arbitrary that people have come up with: maximal knowledge, maximal goodness, maximal power, and necessary existence, because these are thought to be great-making attributes, the kinds of attributes that would flow from a foundation that would have the highest degree of value. And then this theory further seems to predict all sorts of other things we know. For example, that there are rules of logic, rules of reason. Well, this is just what would be the result of a perfect foundation. Perfect foundation would have the great-making attributes of power, including cognitive power, and maximal cognitive power, which is going to imply that it has the capacity to reason perfectly, which implies perfect rules of reason. And so that's what we would expect if there is this simple basic foundation that's perfect. Whereas on the denial of that hypothesis, then we don't have that same prediction. We don't have that same expectation.
Josh,
so my thought is that this is one reason to think that the theory is true.
I wanted to, because I sort of got lost after the second argument that you gave was the sort of arbitrary limits. Like, we don't want to have these arbitrary limits because it sort of gives us a sense that we should be explaining these limits. What was the first argument that you gave?
Yeah, so there's kind of two arguments that go together. So the first is an argument from simplicity, for thinking that the foundation has the simplest theory, and then my argument is that the simplest theory of the foundation is that it's perfect. That's the conceptually simplest theory of the foundation. And then from perfection, you can derive the classic theistic attributes. That's the thought.
Gotcha. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lance. And like I said, I've been muting Lance manually, and so I'm going to turn it over to you right now. So here we go.
Okay, thank you very much for muting me. I can't mute myself. If I could jump in and out and probably it wouldn't take too long. But yeah, if it's a problem, we can do that. But okay, so I have two thoughts about this idea that the simplest thing would be perfect. On one hand, it seems not unlikely to me at all that there may not be any maximally perfect way to be. There might be various perfections or various great-making attributes that are incompatible, right? You might think, for example, mercy and fairness. It's good to be merciful and it's good to be fair, but there are some times when you can't be both, right? There are some times where the merciful thing to do is kind of unfair to other people who don't get maybe can't get the same mercy. And I mean, I would even point out that there are philosophers like Peter van Inwagen who have tried to give us a theodicy that, well, maybe there just isn't any greatest possible world. No matter what world God could create, that would kind of sort of maximize the virtues of the universe that he wants to maximize. There's no way to get to the top of that. And in virtue of that, you might think, well, then there is no maximal being, because there could always be a being that would make the world better, or that would have produced a nicer creation, and maybe there just isn't any such maximal greatness. My other thought on the complete opposite end is, well, why can't this ultimate cause lack all virtues, all perfections? It doesn't seem like having any virtues or perfections or anything like that is super relevant to its being an explanation. And I mean, I guess primarily I'd say it doesn't seem like the quality of being an explanation is a perfection or is a valuable quality at all to have. So I guess those are my two thoughts, and I can throw them back to Josh.
Those are great thoughts. Yeah. So to the first, I think, yeah, maybe there is no maximum. In fact, if you have a good reason to think there is no maximum with respect to value, that will defeat this argument from simplicity. My thought is that simplicity is a reason for intrinsic probability, other things being equal. Of course, other things may not be equal, so maybe there's some incoherence in the notion. You mentioned the idea that, well, maybe for every world there could be a greater world. And if there's no maximally great world, maybe similarly there's no maximally great being. And again, I just want to say, yeah, maybe, right? I mean, if we have some reason to think that there couldn't be a maximally great being, I do acknowledge that would defeat the argument. I don't think it follows from a non-maximal great world that there isn't a maximally great being. In fact, I mean, I'll just speak for myself. You know, you are invited to consider it from your own perspective, of course. I seem to have this concept of absolute axiological perfection, and it strikes me as coherent when I consider it. Whereas when it comes to the maximal world, it's less clear because a world is going to involve a variety of things, and I'm not sure, maybe you could always add more things, and maybe there's no limit to the number of things. But that seems very different in my mind from the idea that perfection or absolute perfection could be instantiated in something, such as a being. So again, I do think, yeah, maybe if there's a reason to think that there's an incoherence there, we could look at, there are, of course, classic arguments against coherency of a maximally great being. We could look at that. Right, so I'm now forgetting the second point. What was the second point again, if you could just remind me?
Oh, the second point was, well, so you'd said, I guess it would be arbitrary to suppose that it was anything less than perfect, but why not say that it has no valuable qualities at all? And that's not arbitrary either, right? That's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
I feel like that's just exactly the right question to ask. I actually have a video on this. So, you know, I mean, the simplest view is going to be that it's like at the extreme, either extremely great or extremely defective, or maybe it's just not even on the scale of axiology at all. So, you know, why think it has any values? It's zero value. Right. So I want to think about that with you, that hypothesis. So we could think about its ability to produce things, its explanatory.
Yeah, hey, Josh, real quick, if you don't mind, I wanted to see if, Lance, you could go ahead and restart your computer real quick. That way you can, you know, I know that your screen is sort of frozen over there.
No worries, I'll do it right now.
So Josh, save that response. What you were about to talk about, you're thinking about this video that you've produced. So have that in your mind. And then on that note, why don't we talk a little bit about what you're doing at your YouTube channel while Lance is restarting his computer. So what's
I'm back.
Actually, oh wow.
Yeah, I actually didn't need to restart my computer. But I honestly okay, sorry, never mind. But yeah,
I was gonna say I still want to know the answer to this question. So Josh, how did your YouTube channel come about, and why did you want to start it?
Yeah, so my channel is Worldview Design, and my interest is to just follow reason and evidence wherever it leads, focusing on the big questions. And also, sometimes I think philosophers, we care so much about truth, but sometimes we forget about relevance. And so I'm looking for an intersection between what I think is actually true, what reason and evidence leads, and I don't care if it leads somewhere that I didn't believe before. That's great. That'll be fun to discover that. But I'm also looking for the kinds of truths that I think can really serve people and encourage them and their own thinking through for themselves of their worldview. So it gets at the kind of big questions of worldview. And that's it. I mean, that's my passion, is just to share insights that I think matter and to have a conversation with people about that.
Nice. Well, I mean, I'm going to suggest anybody who hasn't seen his YouTube channel or any of his videos, go there immediately after this discussion. But so let's, right. So Josh, let's get back to this question or your response that you were about to give. It goes back to this video you've already made. So Josh, why don't you go ahead and take it away? And I'm glad that Lance's his technical difficulty is fixed there. But so Josh.
Yeah, so there are a few different thoughts to explore here. And I mean, and I am actually just still exploring myself. So I'm happy to discover new things even in our conversation here. But so one thought has to do with power, or explanatory power, or explanatory capacity. And the idea is that if we're looking first at the simplest theory, first because that's the intrinsically most likely, but second because any cutoffs are going to be relevantly like the kinds of things that are known to have an explanation. So those are two independent reasons to prefer a simple theory, which then predicts that it would have maximal explanatory power, maximal conceivable explanatory power. Now I can conceive of something that is capable of thinking and capable of producing consciousness, capable of producing every possible object. And so the thought is that that's not going to be a maximally defective thing. In fact, it's going to be on the scale of value. So I actually think, and this is perhaps a bit controversial. I mean, I'm sure it is controversial, but I mean, it seems to me, I can only just tell you how it seems. It seems to me that this maximal power, including the power to produce consciousness and everything else, is a great feature, and it puts it on the scale of axiology. And so then, since it's on the scale of axiology, I want the simplest account of its total value. When I say axiology, I mean its value. I think it has some value, not moral value. I'm talking about something more fundamental, more basic concept that I think we recognize when we attribute value to someone. And if I'm attributing value to you, for example, and I say, well, you have all this power, but you're limited in your cognitive power, and you're limited in your, moral abilities. I'm not attributing to you maximal value there. And I think we understand there's a concept, at least I have a concept for that. So in view of that concept, it seems to me that the simplest account of its degree of power and then degree of value in the scale of axiology is that it's perfect. And so that gives you the maximal greatness. I'm curious to hear your questions and objections, because I know that there's a lot there on that one.
Yeah. So this is, I guess, how my intuitions lie. When I think, well, let's see. When I think of power being valuable, I'm thinking of the power of an agent. And that seems to be primarily what people are usually talking about. It's greater to be able to do more things. I don't mean, I think, I guess a kind of more, I don't know, the kind of power that's associated not with agents. Maybe you might have a machine that's capable of, I don't know, those electricity machines that can produce an arc of electricity, right? I wouldn't think that like one of those that could produce an even greater electrical charge would be, just intrinsically greater for it, or maybe a battery that could just store that much more energy would be intrinsically greater for it. So yeah, when we were talking about impersonal things, it doesn't really seem to me that that kind of power is valuable.
So it's almost like you're saying that we're sort of smuggling in this concept of personhood.
Yeah, I kind of think so, in a sense. There's kind of a way in which an agent behaves, a way in which an agent has control over their environment, and you kind of see that as a good making property of an agent. That, I don't know, a powerful agent is a great agent. I don't know, but it seems a little odd to extend that to impersonal things acting, I guess, mechanistically in the universe.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about this perfect being, Like we're already sort of assuming that this being is a personal agent, and that's why we can deduce all these other different properties. Is that sort of, am I way off base there, Lance?
Yes, I don't think.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I wasn't thinking of that. I didn't realize we were already assuming it was a personal being. But I guess Josh can talk and clarify that.
Yeah, so I'm not thinking that it's a personal being. And actually, I wonder if there are a few different things to consider here. But I'm curious, actually, Lance, whether if we put value aside and we just focus on sort of this impersonal causal capacity, whether you would think that a maximal conceivable causal capacity would include the capacity to produce consciousness and values and the like of that.
So by a maximal conceivable causal capacity, do you just mean the capacity to cause anything, right? I'm assuming that's what you mean. In which case, that would trivially follow, right?
So I share that thought as well, which is one reason I would think that a maximally powerful foundation would have at least the capacity for producing consciousness and value. And now that doesn't automatically imply that it has value. I mean, that's a separate premise, but I wanted just to put value to the side, just to explore your intuitions about that much.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose yeah. Well, okay, maybe we could take a step back and I could offer you an alternate hypothesis to the one you're giving. Suppose there is a necessary ultimate cause that explains all of reality, but it really only explains one thing. And that one thing then explains everything else, right? So it is at the top of the causal explanatory hierarchy, but it doesn't itself explain it doesn't directly explain everything, right? And so that would be very incompatible with the picture you're trying to give, where there's this thing that explains everything, right? Am I right about that?
I agree. Yeah, my pictures consist of that hypothesis. Yeah, I'm with you there.
All right. Well, then how about this? It strikes me as implausible that there is one single thing that explains everything. That is just an intuition I have. I don't know, maybe you guys don't share that, but it seems weird to me to think that there's some overarching explanation for all of the very unique and different particular things that exist in the universe. And I would expect that every particular thing has an explanation, and those things have explanations, and there's a sort of, a tower being built up to the very top. But I would not expect that ultimate thing at the top has anything to do with these things at the bottom, right?
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because it kind of fits with another question I was just going to ask, which is whether the theory that the foundation has perfection within it would actually, and that it has value, because we're sort of on this question about why would it have value, whether that would then provide an explanation of a range of things that we observe in the effect, including a moral landscape. And this isn't an argument that you need to have God for a moral landscape. It's rather an argument from expectation that if you have value at the foundation, that gives us a mechanism to explain why reality unfolds in such a way that leads to moral agents and moral communities and even these sorts of interesting conversations. And so that would sort of predict that. Whereas without value at the foundation, you don't have this kind of mechanism to predict that. It's not that it would be impossible. Perhaps that's a different argument to think about, whether that would even be possible to get value from non-value. But even granting that that's theoretically possible, we don't have the same kind of mechanism to predict that. So I wonder if you might think that could be some reason to think that the foundation actually does have value. This doesn't quite address your concern that why I think just one thing could explain everything else. Maybe if the one thing has certain attributes, maybe it's one thing, but it has many attributes that flow from a more core, simple basic attribute, and those many attributes allow it to explain many things. I wonder if that could possibly help in your thinking of things.
So, yeah, you're probably right in that if the ultimate explanation of all things is, I don't know, say for example, morally good, then that explains, well, actually that doesn't really explain why there is moral goodness, does it? Because you're appealing to a thing that has a property to explain why the property is even there in the first place. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling about this. I'm just shooting off the top of my head.
No, this is really good, Lance. This is a very important distinction, and I think this gets very confused in discussions both in popular and in academic circles. I appreciate this. I want to just clarify. There's a difference even between explaining something and entailing something. Now, I did use the language of explanation because I was thinking of the foundation explaining particular instances of value, like you instantiate value, there's moral communities. But then there's this more general question about how there can be value in the first place. And I don't think that one who says that value is in the foundation has to also say that value is explained by the foundation. I know sometimes people make this argument that God is the best explanation of moral value, but that's not what I want to propose here. Rather, that if the foundation is perfect, then that would entail that there is value. And that entailment then allows us to build a kind of argument from probability that if you have some data, in this case, a moral landscape, or just generally the existence of some value or moral rules or something of that sort, that data will be entailed on theism or on the theory that there's a perfect being. And so that theory then predicts that data. Whereas on the denial or on some more arbitrary theory of the foundation, a more complex theory, which Dawkins wouldn't like, more complex theory, he wouldn't like the theism, but the complex theory, that's not going to straightforwardly predict the same data. And so if those premises are right, then we have some evidence for thinking the foundation has moral value built within it, even if it doesn't explain it, right? Does that make sense to you? What do you think about that?
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean now. I think I misunderstood you at first. I think you're right. I think, yeah, I think that logic sounds sound. But my only issue with this is that it sounds like the premise you're starting with is not really much more plausible than the conclusion. Or in other words, this claim that the ultimate explanation is itself has all the moral virtues doesn't seem more plausible than that there simply are good and evil and virtuous and vicious things in the first place. So it seems a little odd to appeal to the one. Well, actually, maybe that's not even a problem. I guess that's how explanations can work sometimes. Yeah, maybe. Though I have to wonder if we're using explanation in a sort of Bayesianism way, like you were talking about probability a bit there, right? That the one makes the other more likely. If the one is not really more likely anyway than what it's making more likely, it seems like you might not really have much of an argument. Sorry, I'm kind of I'm not really expressing this very well, but does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it might help if I just clarify the premises there. So, I mean, in general, if you have some data and then you have a hypothesis that makes that data more likely than on the negation of that hypothesis, then that data can be seen as supporting the hypothesis. Well, the thought here is that included in our data of experience is a moral realm, and whether you think that that's an objective realm or purely subjective is actually not even central to this argument. But the idea is that the moral realm is entailed on this perfect foundation theory. It's not entailed, at least it's not clear how to get the moral realm on the negation of that theory. And so then if that's right, then that data would provide some support for the theory. Again, it's not a proof, but it would be some support. And I would add that there's additional data that's also explained. I mean, this goes back to your question about could one thing explain everything? Well, maybe it helps that the one thing would have many attributes. So from perfection, you get, from axiological perfection, you get perfect thinking, perfect power, perfect morality. Well, perfect thinking gives you also then the rules of logic. And so then reasoning itself is ultimately based on a rational foundation. Even the sort of laws of physics, something I've been thinking about recently, I'm toying with this thought that the very laws of physics seem to be proposition-like, which sort of reminds me of a thought. And that's unsurprising on this perfect foundation theory, because the perfect foundation would predict perfect reasoning, perfect rationality, which would give it the capacity to create a universe that's orderly. And I think sometimes these conversations between theists and atheists kind of turn into a kind of naturalism versus supernaturalism, but that sort of bothers me because it's actually the sort of natural order of things that I think is explained by this perfect foundation. And we don't need to posit some supernatural, spooky thing beyond the things that were, that are part of ordinary life, including the existence of things. We just posit the simplest account of those ordinary things. That's the thought. So now I'm kind of rambling around here, but I want to give you an opportunity to chime back, object, ask questions.
That's good. I think my thoughts to this kind of, I guess it kind of would be a Bayesian kind of sort of inference, is that you might be right that the probability of there being morality, or the probability of there being good or bad things, of moral properties being instantiated, given that the foundation of reality instantiates moral properties, that is probably higher than the probability that there would be moral properties instantiated, given that the foundation of reality doesn't. But I don't know if it would be that much higher, simply, and it doesn't strike me that this, I guess, this difference between the two conditional probability judgments would be significant enough to then draw a conclusion, or at least, I mean, you can draw a conclusion and you can say it confers, like, a little bit of evidence. I guess it wouldn't feel like a very significant amount of evidence to me. So I guess that's my thoughts. I guess I kind of agree with you that maybe this might actually be evidence, but it just seems like kind of weak evidence to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good observation, that you can have some weight. It doesn't have to be decisive at all. I think part of worldview development and thinking about these things, of course, is just adding up weights and, on both sides and seeing sort of how it ends up. But I also think that, just to emphasize here, that this moral foundation is not an arbitrary posit. I mean, it flows from the concept of a perfect foundation, and that from that basic concept of axiological perfection, you get all the other perfections. So you get perfect reasoning, which gives you logic. You get the power to produce a universe in which not just that there's particular moral laws, but that there are the particular kinds of beings that can have these sorts of interesting conversations. And that's unsurprising, it seems. I don't know, I just want to just say just how it just seems to me. It just strikes me, and I'm just honest with myself about it, it's completely unsurprising that there would be a world in which there are rules of logic, there's a natural order to things, there's a moral framework, there are all these independent observations, reasoning itself. All that seems to flow very nicely from this perfect foundation, and any alternative theory is going to posit additional complexity at the foundation. So while there may be weights on the other side, reasons to sort of doubt the theory in the end, when I consider it, it just seems like it is the most plausible ultimate explanation of reality, given all that I've considered. I don't know if you want to maybe bring up some data points on the other side, or reasons that might incline you to doubt that the foundation is maximally simple and perfect in this way, or kind of what you're thinking.
And let me just pop in here just real quick. I mean, I'm loving this back and forth between you guys, but Lance, you're a moral objectivist or a moral realist. So you think that there are these sort of moral values and duties that are sort of bound up in the foundation. Is that true, or would you say that they're like somewhere else? Are they contingent?
Well, I don't. Yeah, so I certainly think that there are objective moral values and duties and that sort of thing. Whether or not they're contingent, I'm not sure. Well, actually, one thing that's important to point out that people usually gloss over, that when we talk about morality, we're not usually talking about entities, we're talking about properties. We're talking about, for example, the property of being good, or the property of having an obligation to do something, or of an act being obligatory, or of a person being virtuous or vicious. And I don't really have much of a view of what properties are. So, are properties things that exist? Are they necessary? Are they contingent? I think my answer of, what morality is I would just defer to that other debate, which is kind of a controversial one. But one thing I guess I wanted to say is that I agree with you that, if God exists, then you probably would expect logic and morality and an order of nature. But I kind of think that I would expect these things even if God didn't exist. And maybe that just has to do with my own personal views on these things. So maybe that's not really worth getting into, unless you want to. But I'm still not super clear on why the ultimate explanation has to have perfections at all. I know we were talking about that and we kind of drifted away. But going back to that, unless you want to address these things, do you guys, would you rather talk about this, or maybe I should ask?
I'm good. I mean, I was just going to make a general observation that it can be helpful to distinguish between explaining one data versus explanatory scope, where you have a hypothesis that provides an explanation of a wide range of data. And so I think that, right, like any given data might only weigh lightly in the balance. And so this is why these conversations can get often complicated, because there's many different data points to consider. But I'm happy to look at what you just asked right now. You cut out just a bit, so I didn't catch it. So maybe you could repeat it.
Sorry, and actually, could I just mention something that you just said? And I completely agree that an explanation with greater scope is a better explanation. But at the same time, I just have that nagging intuition that whatever explains morality and whatever explains, I don't know, physics, and they're probably not the same thing. So I kind of have that intuition playing up against this other principle of, yes, explanatory scope is good. If there is one thing that explains many things, that's great. That makes for a good explanation. But anyways, yeah, sorry. What I was saying before was I'm still not super clear on why the ultimate cause must have any perfections at all. Why, in other words, for example, the power it exhibits, what we mean when we talk about it having power, and just explanatory power. Why is that seen as a virtue or a perfection?
Yeah, so my thought is, even if we bracket the value question, we bracket that question, I think there's an independent argument that maximal power would include the power, it would include maximal cognitive power and the power to produce a moral landscape. So that's still something. But as for the value question, why I think now this just may be a clash of intuitions. It seems to me that if I'm attributing worth to something and I'm considering its value, its abilities to produce great things will be among the things that contribute to its total worth. So for example, if there are two beings, one has all knowledge, is morally perfect, but it's really weak, versus another being has all knowledge, is morally perfect, but is maximally powerful, it just strikes me that the maximally powerful one would be the greater being. That's just sort of the sense that I have, that the greatest being that one can think of is going to also have the greatest power. Does that not seem so to you? You don't have that sense or not?
I think, like I said before, only if we're talking about the power of an agent. Otherwise, I don't really have that intuition. But you do have that the maximal power entails the power to create anything. I misunderstood that, I think, the first time you mentioned it. So that, that definitely gets us to where we're trying to go. I can address that.
Would it make sense to put it in this term? So like something non-personal, would it make sense to say that a 200 horsepower engine is not as great as a 400 horsepower engine? But does that even make sense in this context?
Yeah. Or even, let's say, a 10 million power horsepower engine is not greater than a, I don't know, 9 million horsepower engine. Like it seems almost like when we're talking about impersonal things, the greatness of the things they can do, it seems to have more to do with the greatness of what we can use them for. And they're simply being more powerful tools apart from our using them for great things doesn't really seem to make them great in and of themselves. It seems what makes something great is, I don't know, tied to personhood, tied to what people can do with things.
Well, it seems if you want to make that argument that the 9 million horsepower engine wouldn't be greater than the 10 million horsepower, well, you're sort of granting that we can have this sort of this difference of greatness with humans, or with not just humans but personal agents. But so if you accept that, then you would say that a person who can create a 9 million horsepower engine would be less great than a person who could create a 10 million horsepower engine. But if you deny that, then I guess you're denying your original thing that you sort of already accepted, which was that you can have this lesser or greater with persons.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting point. Maybe you're right about that. I guess what I was thinking is, well, when the numbers...
So would you agree that the person who could create the 10 million horsepower would be greater? Or would you just say that it's still just sort of ambiguous there? Like you wouldn't want to say that person is greater.
I kind of want to say it's still ambiguous, and that it depends on what kinds of virtues they're exemplifying. Like, for example, is it more effort? Is it harder to create an engine of that power? If not, then, well, maybe they're not actually greater. They're not doing anything that requires more effort or requires more skill or anything like that. Yeah. Maybe that's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, let's pull Josh back in.
I just actually want to acknowledge that this inference from power to value is not just an easy inference. I actually just want to affirm that. It seems to me that I see that connection, but I wouldn't claim that one must see it, or that it's easy to see, or even that one couldn't be justified in thinking that I'm not seeing it. So I just really just want to affirm that. I'm curious to hear more from you, Lance, about what you're going to say about the inference to maximal cognitive power, from the inference from maximal power to maximal power to produce knowledge in the moral landscape. Seems you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I did. In that, so if we understand maximal power as the power to create anything, well, then God doesn't have maximal power, because God can't just create anything. God couldn't create a hellish existence for all beings, right? The classic William Rose classic thought experiment with skeptical theism, and like, you wouldn't be skeptical about that if beings were just popping into existence of anguish for a millennia and then going out of existence for no greater reason for their birth. That is a scenario God would not create, and not just would not, he could not. It's a part of his essential nature. It's a part of his nature to never do that sort of thing. But then how do you square that with the idea that God has maximal power, if that's how you're defining it?
Good question. So yeah, I wouldn't define it. I mean, God can't create himself. He can't create an uncreated being. That would be contradictory. So I agree that we can't understand maximal power in terms of the power to create anything. But I think we can just understand it very simply as having as much power as any being could be. And when we're thinking about a theory or a hypothesis of the foundation, and we spell that out in terms of conceptually basic components, we can ask how much power is even conceivable for being different. So I wonder if you would think that maximal conceivable power would include not the power to do contradictions, but would include the power to know things, to reason perfectly, etc.
Well, we maybe need to be careful when we talk about, the power to do contradictions, because none of these things, like say, for example, the power to be cruel to someone for no greater reason, that is a power I have that God does not. Or at least that's something it is possible for me to do. I can be cruel to people for no good reason. God cannot, because God is, by his nature, a perfect being. He would never be cruel to someone for no good reason. So there's nothing inconsistent or contradictory about the action itself. What's contradictory is the action and the nature of the agent. But then what if this ultimate being, it was just a part of their intrinsic nature that they didn't have the power to, I don't know, produce minds or consciousness or anything like that? I don't see why that's any more or any less of a limitation than what you would say about God power to create, produce evil or something like that.
Yeah, so there's a number of issues in play here. So first, there's the concept of maximal power. Those of you watching this may be interested in checking out Flint and Fredosso's account of maximal power, thinking through their analysis of it. I think that what they're doing is unpacking what having as much power as a being could possibly have would imply in more careful terms. And I agree with you, Lance, that wouldn't imply the power to do something that is the very nature of a perfect being. I don't think maximal power implies that. But then you ask whether it might have built within its nature, if I understood you correctly, maybe some limit so that it wouldn't have maximal power. And so that's a great question. And then we're back at this question about whether the foundation might have some arbitrary limits, some limits that have no further explanation. And so we could explore that further. We could look at that. But if it doesn't have arbitrary limits, if it is maximal, then I would wonder whether, I guess this is what I think is the case, is that it would have maximal cognitive powers, and that would maybe go some way toward addressing your worry about whether the foundation would have value, perhaps. I'm curious what you think of any of those things.
Well, these aren't arbitrary limits because it's their essential nature to be limited in that way, if you want to call it a limitation at all. I actually personally, I wouldn't say that God is limited because God can't, create gratuitous evil. Yeah, okay, so I guess what I'm saying is, so there is a necessary being, and it has as a part of its essential nature, for example, that it can't create gratuitous evil. That is a necessary fact then. That is not an arbitrary limit. That's a fact that had to be, a fact that couldn't have been otherwise. Now, why can't we suppose that instead of it instead of it not being possible for it to create gratuitous evil, why can't we suppose that it's not possible for it to create minds or something else like that? Why gratuitous evil and not other things? And maybe even to borrow a previous argument of yours, it's not like gratuitous evil is significantly different from all the other kinds of things that there are in the universe. Anyways, yeah, back to you, I suppose.
Yeah, I would think that it couldn't create anything incompatible with the nature of perfection if it's perfect. So that's why it wouldn't be able to create gratuitous evil, but that wouldn't block it from creating conscious beings. Does that seem true to you?
Yeah, sure. I suppose if we are going to say that it is then perfect. Yeah, I guess. But yeah, okay. So I guess it's going back to the argument, or going back to whether or not this being is in fact perfect. It is on the spectrum of perfections. And sorry, I know you gave a little another point about how that leads to it, right? Or I kind of missed that.
Okay, yeah, well, either that is perfect or that is just maximal in power. So if it has maximal power, your point is that that power will still provide a limit that doesn't detract from perfection, but a limit that is implied by perfection. In other words, the limit of creating gratuitous evil. And so I guess that's consistent with it being maximally powerful. And so then we were thinking about, let's put the value implication aside. Let's say we're not sure if maximal power to produce great things implies having value. Would it at least imply having maximal cognitive and moral capacities, which maybe then could provide another path to infer value?
Well, yeah, I don't see why it would. I can't come up with any good example of a necessary being that could not produce, minds or embodied minds. But I don't see why that would be impossible or inconceivable. And I suppose, yeah, so you want to say, so God is incapable of, or not incapable. I keep switching between that language. I don't want to say that God is incapable of creating gratuitous evil. I want to say he can't, because I am a compatibilist about free will. So I want to say that you can be capable of doing things that you can't do. But yeah, supposing
let me just jump in real quick, because we're getting really close to the time mark here. It's almost 10 o'clock where I am. So we've nearly been going 2 hours, and like I was saying, even in the first section, we could talk about these things forever. To reach a stopping point, my wife is really ready for me to take over. We have a new baby. He's about 6 weeks old, so she's been with him all day. I came home from work, and so I'm sure that she's ready for me to take him off her hands. So at this point, why don't we do this? Why don't we move to some sort of closing remarks, some sort of closing statements? Just Josh, if you could, summarize. Why don't we do that? So Josh, summarize sort of the first section, and then the second section as best you can, and then Lance, give your thoughts on what he says, and then I'll go ahead and close it out.
Well, thank you. I've just really enjoyed this. Talking with you, Lance, has been a great pleasure. And I just wanted to say that sometimes in these conversations, there are these categories that identify the people under what they believe. And then this can sort of lead to a certain kind of polarization. But this conversation, I think, really shows the opposite of that. It's just a lot of fun. We're just people. I'm not under a category. Lance isn't really under a category. We're just people exploring things together. And I think that's how insights flow the best. And so just kind of one of my core values. I think people can just learn a lot more when they see each other as persons and just trying to figure out the world together. We just learn much more in that way. So just a brief summary. Here's a reason to think that reality divides into two categories. First, the best explanation for why there are contingent things, I guess these are the contingent things, is going to be ultimately in terms of a necessarily existing thing. Why? Because contingent things can't really explain their own existence. They don't have necessary existence built within them. But a necessarily existing thing, well, it would be just the kind of thing that would have no outside explanation. And that would provide an account of why reality in total has no outside explanation, because it has a foundational necessary existing thing that has no outside explanation. And then we can theorize together. No matter what your views are about the world, we can just think together. If we've come to the conclusion of stage one, we can think together about what's the best account of the nature of the foundation. And it seems to me, given all that I've considered, that the best account is going to be the simplest. It's going to be in terms of that this basic attribute of perfection from which you get wide explanatory scope, including the moral realm, the rules of logic, consciousness. We didn't talk about fine-tuning. And it's, again, not a proof, but it's just, given all that I've considered, the best account of the nature of the foundation.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I'd also like to say that I really enjoyed talking to you, Josh, and to Cameron. But this is of all the arguments for God's existence, I think this is probably the most complicated or difficult for me personally to wrap my head around. So I really love how much effort you're putting into this, Josh, to like make things clear and understandable. But yeah, it's an interesting argument. I honestly am not sure what to think yet about the conclusion of a necessary being, though I'm not terribly skeptical. I could accept it if maybe I'll mull it over and maybe I will come to agree with you on that. To the second point, I am more skeptical about that, I guess, as we gone into. Maybe part of the problem is that I just don't really have strong axiological intuitions in the first place. And so I'm kind of trying to go along and agree that, yeah, okay, power is valuable, but I probably wouldn't even, or I said before that I can agree that power is a valuable thing when we're talking about agents, though even then I'm not entirely sure if I would say that categorically, right? So maybe I'm just the wrong kind of skeptic to be talking about this issue, but yeah, overall this is a really interesting argument. I really enjoyed talking with you guys.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys both for coming on. And I've got some really cool things in the works that I'll be letting you guys know here pretty soon. But just to remind you really quickly, if you want to check out what we're doing, capturingchristianity.com is the website. See me on Facebook, facebook.com/capturingchristianity. We have a Twitter account now @capturingchrist. I do a little bit here and there with it. I'm not on Twitter all day long like I am on Facebook. And then beyond that, if you want to email me, capturingchristianity@gmail.com. You can email me show ideas, any of your thoughts on past shows, any of your thoughts on the blog posts that you see at the website, anything at all. Feel free to just send me an email. But beyond that, thank you for watching. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube since that's where you're going to be watching this. And beyond that, have a good night.